In the classic 1989 movie Field of Dreams, one of the great moments is when Dr. Archibald Graham comes to the cornfield and is transformed into his younger self, young Moonlight Graham, who in 1905 appeared in one game for the New York Giants, but never got a time at bat. Well, there was another baseball player with a similar story, and his career began in 1911 in Ashland, Kentucky.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2. Okay. My name is Ray Shook, and today is Saturday, July 8th, 1961. Most people know me as a general manager of Navajo Freight Lines in South Bend, Indiana. But I have a story about me that only my close friends and family ever knew, and I want to leave this behind for my grandchildren and for their grandchildren. My story began in 1911 in Ashland, Kentucky. I was 21. I had played baseball in my hometown of Ferry, Ohio, a lot as a kid. In the spring of 1911, I signed a contract to play for the Ashland-Catlettsburg Twins in the Mountain States League, which was Class D, the lowest level of minor league baseball. When I reported to the team, I discovered a very nice baseball field at a huge amusement park called Cliffside Park. It was a very busy place. It was what was called a trolley park. 2 trolley lines met there, and you could take the trolley all the way from Ashland, Kentucky to Catlettsburg and across the river to Huntington, West Virginia. There were very few automobiles then, but the trolley could take me anywhere I wanted to go. I had a pretty good year playing for the Twins and began moving up in the minors fairly well. 3 years later, in 1914, I was playing for Racine, Wisconsin, and Pance Rowland was manager for the Peoria Club. He saw me play and seemed to like me. He had been an undersized reserve catcher in the minors, never a great player, but his love for the game drove him. He told me that the White Sox were interested in me. I think he saw a lot of himself in me. After the 1914 season, Charles Comiskey, owner of the White Sox, surprised everyone by naming Rowland as White Sox manager. Some say it was because of Comiskey's legendary cheapness, and Rowland was just happy to be in the big leagues. In 1915, I was at Racine again. I was doing pretty well, and late in the season, my manager told me that I was being called up to the big team, the Chicago White Sox. At that time, Chicago had the makings of a great team. They were actually 2 years away from winning the World Series. Anyway, I became one of their late season call-ups. I was 25 years old, and I had played in less than 200 games in the minors. And I was, for a catcher, pretty small, 5'7" and 155 pounds. When I went into that locker room the first time, I saw Eddie Collins, second baseman, Ray Schalk, their catcher, who was already a star at age 22. He was younger than me. And Red Faber, a great pitcher. Those 3 guys all made the Hall of Fame, which wasn't even a thing yet back then. We also had 3 other great players, pitcher Eddie Sicott, shortstop Buck Weaver, and shoeless Joe Jackson, who was already a legend at age 27. There was a lot of talk about how the veterans would make it very difficult for a young kid, but I was very pleasantly surprised when Ray Schalk, their star catcher, was the first to welcome me to the White Sox. I did my best to respect the space of the veterans, and most of them finally seemed to accept me. Well, except for Shoeless Joe and Buck, and Sicott. They treated me like I didn't exist. I didn't get into any regular season games, but I did catch in one exhibition game against the Pittsburgh Pirates, and I did okay. In early 1916, I went with the White Sox to Mineral Wells, Texas for spring training. It was my first trip into the South. At the end of spring training, I was on the White Sox roster, although I was the third string catcher. One of my great moments was when we got back to Chicago for the season opener, and we all lined up to have the team photo made. As everyone lined up, I stood back, not wanting to offend anybody. I was still the new kid. As I looked on, Ray Schalk motioned for me. "Hey, Shook," he said, "come stand beside me for the photo." That was one of my great moments in baseball. I still have that photo framed. About 2 weeks into the season, I hadn't been in a game yet, but in mid-April, we were playing the St. Louis Browns at Comiskey Park, and it was a close game. We were a run behind in the 8th inning, and Pants Rollin pitch hit Jack Lapp, who batted for Fred McMullen. Lapp drew a walk, but he was a slow runner. I was probably the fastest man on the bench, so Pants called time and motioned for me to go in as a pinch runner. I wasn't expecting this, so I didn't have time to get nervous. I ran to first base, and the Browns' first baseman, George Sisler, another Hall of Famer, said, "Welcome to the majors, kid." I nervously said, "Thank you, Mr. Sisler." That made him laugh out loud. "You're lucky this isn't a game against the Tigers. Ty Cobb would spit tobacco juice on your shoes and then spike you." Then he laughed. Before I knew it, the inning was over and I had barely moved off first base. Our new pitcher came in and I was back on the bench. At that time, I had no idea that that would be my one and only moment in a major league game. Not long after that game, I was back in the minors and never returned. The few people who know about my major league record, one game and no at-bats, often react by saying, "I'm sorry you didn't get another chance." I felt like that myself for a few years. But looking back now, I was on the same field with St. Louis Browns pitcher Eddie Plank and shortstop Bobby Wallace, who would also go to the Hall of Fame. And of course, Mr. Sisler. I still laugh about that today. That was the best 5 minutes of my baseball life. That was the best day of my baseball life. Not bad for a skinny third string catcher.